It is my tremendous joy to introduce our guest speaker today, Rabbi Rachel Silverman, who is the founding director of Camp Ramah Day Camp here in Boston. They began as a tiny little startup, and they are going strong, impacting Jewish families all over the region. And we're so blessed that she's here today to share with us an experience that they recently had at the day camp that impacts all of our lives. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. Doing things because they're good for me has never really been enough to get me to change my behavior. I'm hyper aware of that, as someone who eats too many processed foods, hasn't seen the inside of a gym in years, and often doesn't wear enough sunscreen. So while I'm guessing that many of you will find yourselves nodding along to what I'm about to say, in all likelihood, changing is actually a whole nother matter. This just isn't how behavior modification works. Even Pavlov had to give a bunch of treats, and I'm sorry I left mine at home. And that's especially true when we're up against something deliberately designed to addict us. A few weeks ago, I gave a presentation to the board of directors of Ramah New England about an experiment that we had done at the day camp this summer. When it was over, Rabbi Robinson practically rushed over to me and said, "You have to come give a sermon at Temple Emmanuel." What was the presentation about? Well, you know those crazy ideas that you're sure if you say out loud, people will look at you as if you have three heads? I had one of those. I couldn't stop thinking that we had an amazing opportunity to do a social experiment and see what would happen if we stopped using our phones at camp for 3 days. I broached it first with a few select senior staff members. I picked them not because I trusted their input more than others, but because I thought they would be better at not laughing at me. And it turned out that they didn't laugh at all. They were ridiculously eager to try it. They too had become totally overwhelmed with their phone use, and they were seeing it in the young staff members around us. We all know this in our own lives. Putting away our phones is good for us. It's good for our kids. It's good for our mental health. It's good for Shabbat, and it's good for our community. We are addicted, and we need to find other ways to disconnect ourselves. But before I share more, I want to tell you a story about a different kind of addictive behavior. My grandparents gave up smoking cold turkey in 1959, not because they knew it was slowly killing them. And not because they no longer enjoyed it, it got too expensive, or they no longer liked the smell. They gave up smoking because one day, while they were driving, one of them tossed the cigarette out their window. But instead of landing on the ground as they expected it to, the wind pushed it back into the car through the open window of the back seat. Still lit, it landed on the mattress that their young daughter, my aunt, was lying on, caught fire, and almost killed their child. From that day on, they were done smoking. Cigarettes could have killed their kid. We might be incredibly slow to change our behavior for ourselves, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a parent who wouldn't give up almost anything to protect their child. And that's the same story that I want to share with you today. When I was growing up, the walls of the JCC pool were adorned with a quote from the Talmud. Kiddushin 29a dictates that it is a parent's obligation to teach a child to swim. You know this. For generations of people who lived by water, knowing how to swim was an essential survival tool, both so they could safely cross over bodies of water on purpose, and so they could rescue themselves if they found themselves in water unexpectedly. Before the days of summer camps and swim schools, the way you taught your kid to swim was by knowing how to swim yourself. You led by example. Perhaps your first attempt wasn't perfect, and maybe you asked your neighbor for help. Maybe there was a community member who happened to be very skilled at water safety, and they took it upon themselves to teach your kids. Even so, you likely practiced with them on hot days or whenever your chores took you to the river. The JCC didn't choose the Talmudic quote by accident. They chose it because teaching swimming was, and still is, a core piece of what they do. It is not surprising, therefore, that the JCC's current swim program focuses primarily on swim safety. In fact, one of the tests that kids need to pass to move up a level is to be thrown into the pool, fully clothed, and be able to float and get themselves to safety. First and foremost, it is not about perfection of strokes, but rather about having the skills to survive, quite literally, in the deep end. I share this with you because this past summer, the summer camp that I run, Ramah Boston, embarked on 2 major shifts in our program, with the goal of offering our campers and counselors a new set of skills to survive and thrive in today's world. At first glance, the 2 topics seem worlds apart, but in reality, they're very aligned. This summer, we adopted the same swim program that the JCC uses and recommended to us. Founded by former Olympian Lenny Kraselberg, the Swim Right Academy begins by giving the kids the foundational water skills to survive. They spend a lot of time on the back float, because if you can successfully float on your back, you can stay in the water indefinitely until help arrives. From there, the swim program builds the skills for swimmers to learn to swim correctly and then ultimately to swim fast. To be transparent, this program annoyed a lot of parents. These parents had kids who could doggy paddle across the pool but couldn't yet master the back float. So you can imagine how happy they were to hear that their kids were now back in the beginner level. It took a lot of explaining, but once we did, most parents were grateful for the emphasis on skill building for safety. The other major culture shift that we did, with the goal of giving the next generation the skills that they need to survive in the world, centered around this 3-day experiment of putting away staff phones and replacing them with old school technology. Why do we do it? At the start of the summer, I found myself walking through camp with my eyes pointed down at my phone. It took a lot of effort not to trip over campers, and I wasn't always successful. During staff week, I had all the bunk counselors pull out their phones and create WhatsApp groups, one for each bunk, to give them a direct line of communication with the nurse, the camper care team, and the senior leadership. This, I reasoned, would make camp safer and run more smoothly. It turns out that it might have made the people at camp more informed, but it also made us less engaged, less present, and truthfully, less happy. The number of texts and emails and WhatsApp messages quickly became overwhelming. I finally recognized we had a problem when I didn't know a counselor had called in sick until midday when I finally got through all of my messages, which was hours after he tried to reach out to me. There were other hints that we had a problem. We had young staff members who didn't know how to have a face-to-face conversation with me and instead relied on their parents to ask for time off, review their salaries, and in 2 shocking examples, to quit. Another hint was the overwhelming volume of our Hadar Ochel, the dining hall, because instead of calm conversations, campers were shouting to get attention. Camp was overrun with pings, beeps, buzzes, rings, all day long. In the meantime, coincidentally or not, I had been listening to Jonathan Haidt's book titled The Anxious Generation on my drive into camp each day. I became more and more convinced that phones, or rather the screens in our pockets, were doing irreparable harm to our teens and to the summer camp experience. When the iPhone made its debut in 2007, they felt like what Haidt describes as digital Swiss Army knives, full of tools that we could call on whenever we needed them. It had everything from a compass to a flashlight to a camera, plus it made phone calls. It wasn't addictive, but it was incredibly useful. That changed quickly with the onset of social media and the various app stores. By the 2010s, our phones had transformed from Swiss Army knives, which we pulled out whenever we needed a tool, to platforms upon which companies competed to see who could hold on to eyeballs the longest. So I will quote you just one more statistic and then recommend that if you haven't already read it, you should add the book to your list. By 2010, 70% of American teens carried a touchscreen around with them, and these screens became much better at holding their attention, even when they were with their friends. Children today are experiencing what Haidt calls a phone-based childhood, as opposed to the play-based childhood that their parents grew up with. So imagine the bells that went off in my head when I read David Brooks's New York Times article last week about how people around the world are getting happier, except for those of us who live in some of the nations with the highest standards of living, such as America, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And before you say, well, of course, things are looking pretty bleak right now, these measurements are over a longer period of time than the past few years. In 2007, 67% of Americans and Canadians said that they were thriving. Now it's down to 49%. Brooks offered many compelling reasons for this downturn, but the one that he doesn't cite is the one that Haidt emphasizes. Teen mental health took a sharp downward turn in the early 2010s with the advent of social media in our pockets. And now, those former teens are the adults answering these surveys. Okay, I'm done. You're gonna trust me. I'm done proving to you that putting away our phones is a good thing. I'm just gonna tell you about what happened when we did it at camp. As with most experiments, there were things that worked and things that didn't. But in our all-staff debrief afterwards, here were some of the most impactful takeaways. The camp photographer said that she could see from the pictures she was taking that the staff was more engaged than before. The production of friendship bracelets increased because our fingers needed something to do other than scroll through a screen. As lighthearted a sign of success that this was, it actually was a very real visual and physical sign of how much our hands were on our phones before and then weren't. Our teens without their phones became more resilient and able to problem solve on their own. Whereas with a quick push of a button, they used to be able to call a member of the camper care team to effectively solve for them whatever problem they were dealing with. Instead, they started problem solving on their own quite effectively. This is not to say that they didn't still call for help when they needed it, but rather that their definition of when they needed help shifted. And here's a crazy result. Visits to the nurse's office dropped significantly in number and dramatically in urgency. I grew up at Camp Grossman in the 80s and 90s. My dad was the director, and while I do remember him packing up our Apple IIe every year and literally buckling it into the back seat of the car so that he could transfer it to camp, the technology used to run Grossman was minimal. I have no doubt that they're in the modern era now, but in those days, like every other camp or household, everything was done old school. The lists of campers, literally multiple inches thick, was printed on dot matrix paper. Bus attendance was taken by hand, written in folders with specific instructions on how to notate whether a kid was absent or present. And one Sunday every spring, my dad would spend the entire day with his assistant director, painstakingly making bunks of children, ensuring that everyone got their requests. Technology has made all of that easier, simpler, and significantly faster, which I appreciate. But I'm not sure it's always been made better. So let me bring this back to swimming, or rather to the Talmud. Today, teaching and modeling proper phone use for our kids and grandkids is as important and life-saving as teaching those kids to swim was in Talmudic times. The waters of our time are not just rivers and seas. They're social media feeds, algorithm-driven comparison, and the addictive design of smartphones. Just as we wouldn't send a child into a strong current without the skills to swim, we can't send them into the digital ocean without guidance. I almost forgot to tell you what happened at the end of our 3-day experiment at camp. During those initial 3 days, we asked for feedback and made adjustments. The biggest one was to reassure our young staff that if they needed help, no one was going to judge them for pulling out their phones and calling for backup. After the initial 3 days were up, we had another community meeting and asked for feedback. Ultimately, what we heard, sometimes publicly, but more often in private conversations, was that the teens actually liked the phone-free environment. They needed someone else to make the rules because being the only person without a phone wasn't socially acceptable. But being forced to put their phones down felt good. I couldn't have planned it better. It's okay, you helped me, thank you very much. They knew that they were better counselors when they were able to be more present. So while we loosened our standards a tiny bit, as in, I reinforced that phones could be used when absolutely necessary, we kept the spirit of the rule in place. No phone use around campers. And it was game-changing. Experts recognize that cell phone use among teens is a problem. The question is, are the rest of us ready to change our habits for the sake of teaching our kids and grandkids to swim in these new digital waters? Just as we learn to swim under the tutelage of a teacher and the watchful eye of a lifeguard, perhaps Shabbat and this space can be the shallow and safe waters in which we dip our toes for learning how to build digital resilience and letting go of our reliance on our phones. Using Shabbat as a way to reset our minds and our brains, as well as the relationships that we want to cultivate, can help build some muscle memory for the rest of the week, allowing it to be easier to ignore the pings of our phones while driving, or leaving phones in our backpacks when at school, yoga class, or when spending time with our loved ones. This is not easy work, because unlike swimming, which involves learning a new, as yet unmastered skill, giving up our phones and reconnecting with one another involves unlearning habits before relearning new ones. But I am confident that we can create safe spaces in which to do it. In fact, you're going to start hearing about schools, both in the Jewish and secular worlds, who are creating phone-free spaces this year. And if they can do it, so can we. Like the rabbis of the Talmud, who knew that the grown-ups might need a push to teach the next generation the skills that they need to flourish, we too may need a push. But it is worth it, for there is nothing less at stake than the flourishing of our next generation. They're counting on us, so let's not let them down. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Wow, Rabbi Silverman, thank you so much.